with nothing but a great future apparently in front of them, were afraid of their shadows. They were insecure. They were so uh, inclined to the career track and afraid of getting into trouble that there were so many things that they um, wanted to talk about and wanted to be vocal about that they couldn't. And it was and if their politics was vaguely what would now be called progressive to the left at all, they just shut up about it. And so you got people who were doing very well on one level who were not living in a free society by consent, and they were in their 20s. And they weren't saying, except in coffee shops and in bars quietly to each other, what they really felt. They didn't say it in the office. They didn't say it on the street. And then I started saying it in print. All the stuff that they thought, but they thought was unthinkable. And I wasn't doing it to shock anybody. I was just reflecting what was going on at the time and what I heard from the people I hung out with, and expressions of my own thought as well, but doing it in terms of satiric humor, in terms of little stories with a beginning and a middle and an end. I mean, that, later on, 3 or 4 or 5 years later, whenever it was, when I became aware of Second City in Chicago and improvisational comedy, I realized that, unbeknownst to me, they were experimenting on stage with exactly what I was doing on paper. Introducing a first line and doing it, and kind of moving forward without anybody knowing clearly where they're going. And that's, I improvised on paper. And what I was improvising was my characters getting into situations and how they would react. And readers reacted to that, because I wasn't telling anybody what to think.
Right.
I was telling them what they thought. And I was having conversations that they had with each other in private. And I was expressing through my characters' doubts, their own insecurities. And once they saw it in print, what I got from everybody is, it's all so obvious. How come nobody else is doing it?
Right.
And I was only doing it because it's what I saw around me, and what I felt, and also the urge to shoot my mouth off.
Huh.
So, and from there, as the times changed and we got into, we started moving toward Vietnam and then into Vietnam, the politics began to take over much more than they had before. And it became much more an expository, radical voice than it was in the beginning, or that I ever intended it to be. It basically, Bob Scher, who used to be the editor of Ramparts and is still around doing Truth Day.
Of where?
What's that?
He was the editor of what?
Ramparts. You ever heard of Ramparts?
Yeah.
Yeah. The Ramparts was a big anti-war publication in the Vietnam years, and he and his staff were big fans of mine. But when we met and became friends, he says, "Funny, your cartoons are much more radical than you are, because my politics, the politics expressed in the cartoons, often went beyond." I was personally much more cautious than my political voice on the paper.
Right. One thing that I've noticed, and Fancher has mentioned this, is that there's a lot of World War II veterans at the Voice.
Yeah.
Which is, interesting. Fancher, Wolf,
yeah.
you.
No, I was
mailer.
I was Korean War.
Yeah, you were Korean War. So there's a lot of veterans.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
know, the Voice, which you know, you don't think of a sort of radical newspaper as being ex-military. um,
Well, it was the post World War II that led to the Korean War generation, that reshaped and redefined what this country was. We were, at the time of the war, in a depression. There was no sizable middle class. What was called the middle class was mostly in the ads in newspapers. Um, and whatever the middle class was, it never made a lot of money. It was only the fact that we weren't hit by bombs or affected economically or physically during the war that we came out of the war and were able to, in a position to explode economically. And there was the GI Bill, you know, and suddenly a whole generation of people whose families had never had any education, who had led hardscrabble lives for generations and generations and generations. Suddenly they were in this thing that was called the middle class, and they could buy little homes, and they could live on, you know, they could live the movie version of the American dream, you know, on a more modest scale. But such a thing had never happened. And it was suddenly the biggest middle class in history, and what I started commenting on many years later in my noir graphic novels that I've just been working on over these past years, is that at the height of all of this incredible explosion after the war, with the biggest burst of affluence and education and opportunity, what our popular forms created for us was science fiction movies with invasions from creatures from another planet who were coming out to threaten us and gobble us, and you know, and noir films where people were betraying each other all over the place. But there was a dark strain throughout this incredible affluence. There were also the MGM musicals, which showed the other side of it, the ebullience and the happiness. But noir in particular, and sci-fi, showed that with all of this incredible optimism, people were, for some reason or other, afraid. And the freedom they should have been enjoying and the outburst they should have been enjoying had a dark side to it. And it's that dark side that I started commenting on, not knowing what I was doing when I was still a kid, and it's what I continue to do to this day.
Today. And when you put it this way, when I listen to you put it this way, it kind of explains to me why so many people, boomer generation or even younger, are angry about the state of affairs. The American dream is gone.
Yes.
And like they feel entitled
and it is
to that moment. But that was a kind of, I think maybe we were all deluded into thinking that was going to be a continuous moment forever. Like that's how it was always. It sounds like it was just a burst, a peak. And it was only going to level out or go down from there, you know.
Well, you see, it's interesting. And I did cartoons on this at the time. The accident of education. We educated and put money into the colleges, and funded the colleges on education on a previously unknown way, never before. Because we had to keep up with the Russians. The Russians were doing Sputnik. The Russians were doing this. So huge money, which never existed before for education, went into education. And as it went into education, it also went into the humanities and other things. So that because of the Cold War, because of the Russians, because the need to make sure the Russians didn't get ahead of us, we started funding things we never intended to fund, like the arts, and all of these things started to happen because of the Cold War, because we were in this war to the death with the Russians, and we had to show them that we were a different kind of society. So we, whether we believed in it or not, and so many of us who ran the country didn't believe in it. So we pretended to believe in something we didn't believe in order to show up those Russians. And that's where so much of the hope and the promise came from. Not because the people who ran us believed in it, but because we had to stand up to the Russians.
When you first started at The Voice, can you remember? Kitty is so funny. You can see her. Can you remember what your biggest sort of columns were, and that got the most reaction, and what?
Well, as much as anything I did, it was the relationship ones between that aside from the politics and the social comments, what I was touching on, because it was all around me and it was also my own story, my own autobiography, was what went on between young men and young women. There was nothing going on about relationships. The humor we had at the time was girly humor, making out humor. It was basically sex, but the sex had nothing to do with sex. It was just teasing, and the men were playing traditional roles that they had played for the last 50, 60, 70 years in cartoons, and the women played seductresses or flappers or ugly girls who thought they could get men or whatever. But everything was the cliche. And I started doing cartoons on what really happened in the conversations that I lived through and that I heard around me and I knew about between people of my generation, how they talked to each other, what led up to the sex or the failed sex, what they expected of each other, how they disappointed or let down each other, how words, and this became basically a byword of what I was doing. Over and over and over, I discovered that my cartoon was not about pictures, it was about language and the misuse of language, and how on every level, relationships between parents and children, between husbands and wives, between men and women, between the government and ourselves, between our politicians, language didn't mean what we said, that we spoke in code. And everybody understood what the code was, but if you exposed the code and said it really means this, people were outraged. They were irritated. They were annoyed. So we all spoke in a code. We all understood. The equivalent of mothers saying something to their children, which they don't mean. The children understand what they don't mean and act accordingly. Excuse me. And but nobody says what you really mean is this. What you really mean is that. And what I was doing but doing it as a form of humor, was a kind of outing of the code. This is, when they say this is what they mean. When you say this in a relationship, you say this is what you mean. When you say this in politics, I was using my 6 to 8 or 9 panels each week to show that that language was not meant to communicate, but to hide communication, to misguide, to misdirect, to mislead, and all of us understood, because we all belonged to the secret open society, which was really a closed society. We all understood by the misuse of the language what was really being said. But if you actually said it, there would be outrage. What are you talking about? How dare you? And I was outing that. I was breaking into the code.
What when did you win the Pulitzer for The Voice? Was it for The Voice?
1986.
Can you tell me about the moment and what the columns were that were submitted
No,
and
I just-
what
it's,
the moment of winning?
I remember looking at the work of that year
Mm-hmm.
and thinking, well, I had not had a very good year. It was every once in a while the Pulitzers would play catch up with people who had been too far out to get the prize when they should have.
It's like the Oscars, right?
And Murray Kempton was one of them, and Jimmy Breslin was another one. They all got the prize 2 or 3 or 4 years later after they should have, and I got it. I should have gotten it when I was doing these strong cartoons against the war in Vietnam and and on civil rights, and on so many issues of the day that nobody would go near me on. I would never get a prize for it because it was too inflammatory. So they gave it to me when I didn't deserve it anymore. And I was happy to get it under any circumstances. But it's again, it's things not being what they appear on the surface.
What would you remember? What your comics were that year?
What's that?
What the work was that year that they awarded? Do you remember?
No, I mean they cite a particular cartoon. It didn't mean anything. I was very happy to get it, but it didn't mean. For me, the real honor I felt. I mean, the Pulitzer Prize was a very welcome prize. It changed my status. It automatically ensured the kind of coverage I would get from the New York Times and other publications because of that. But what I really appreciated on a personal level much more was the regard of my colleagues, the other cartoonists and writers and people around, and journalists and historians who admired my work. That to me was the real prize. That kind of acceptance for a comic strip.
Were you Where were you when you found out about it?
What's that?
Where were you when you found out about it?
Oh, I don't know. I think I was home and I got a call and I was very excited. And
who was the editor?
Who was the editor of The Voice?
Yeah, at the time. Who called you?
I don't remember. I think it might have been David Schneiderman who called me.
Yeah.
I think it was Schneiderman who called me. I don't know who the editor. I went down to the paper. We drank. We celebrated. It was great. I had a great time. And it was fun. It was nice to achieve that, even though, as I said, so much regarding it was just more subterfuge and sham.
What was in the very early days of The Voice, like what was the city like? What was the village like? How did it, what was it like to be at that time?
It was full of ambitious young men and young women who were on the make, there was a lot of, the energy was terrifying. And coffee houses, the coffee house movement had started just a few years before, and folk singers were abounding, and there were and Washington Square was a hangout for singing, and there was just a lot of action, a lot of youth, a lot of people were trying to do things, and off Broadway was exploding, and off Broadway. I mean, just a lot of talent, which was then unrecognized, was just happening and The Voice, through Jerry Tolma, as its theater critic, would visit these little holes in the wall and write about people you never heard of, who you later would became famous, like John Guare and Albee and others.
In Albee, yeah.
Yeah.
Can you talk more about the off-Broadway world at that time? Like, do you remember the first time you started going to those kinds of performances?
it could be as confusing or daunting. There was a lot that was going on that was admirable that I didn't quite understand, and I was certainly not avant-garde. I was very slow-witted about many things, except for the things that I did and was good at. So, and so much that I was square about. So I missed a lot, and or came late a lot to so many things, but I was aware, even though I was missing it, of the excitement that was going on. But I never hung out at the Cedar, with the artists or at the Lion's Head, all of that. I was always a little weary. That's W-A-R-Y of being part of a group. I didn't feel comfortable being attached to movements or groups, even if they represented all the things that I cared about.
Yeah, so you never went to the Lion's Head. That's the spot, right?
The Lion's Head. There was which I never went to. Then there was the very famous bar that I can't because I'm old. I can't remember the name of this place that used to be on the tip of my tongue. And there were all these bars that people went to that I didn't go to.
Did you go to Obie Awards when they first started them?
I'm not sure I did. I thought the Obie Awards were great, but it was long before I thought of myself as part of theater, or wrote plays, or was interested in writing plays. I think I maybe went to the first couple or so, but the scene was not important to me at that time.
Can you tell me a little bit more about Jerry and what kind of a person he was and what he looked like and what he was like to work with?
Since I get a little more of this.
Yeah, okay.
Do you want some more?
No, I'm okay. Thank you.